So one of the claims, I suppose this would be an Enlightenment claim, is that people do have a drive to knowledge, and that that drive is in fact what underlies the production of such things as philosophy. But Nietzsche questions that, because he's trying to bring us back to consideration of the fact that you can't separate the philosopher's mind from the philosopher's being. He's first and foremost a living creature, and he's up to something. And the question is, what is it that he's up to? And so you can see the earliest manifestations in a paragraph like this of what later developed into deconstructionist thought. And that was mostly French continental philosophers who pursued that particular line of reasoning. And it is derived exactly from this kind of statement by Nietzsche. So, for example, someone like Derrida would say, it doesn't matter what the content of a text is. What matters is that the text can be used as a tool for power. And that whether the person who wrote the text knew it or not, that's what they were doing. And they were doing it in a way to privilege themselves above other people. And that's really, I would say, the fundamental deconstructionist claim. And it's a powerful claim. It's an utterly corrupt claim. But it's a really powerful claim, and it's related directly to the sorts of things that Nietzsche was referring to in this paragraph. What is it that the person's truly up to? Now, the problem with the deconstructionist claim is that it's an open invitation to cynicism, to thoughtless cynicism. I can just make the presupposition that whatever it is that you're telling me, you're telling me merely to dominate, regardless of what it is that you claim to be doing. Well, the problem with that approach is that it's predicated on the implicit assumption that the only value that people actually have is the desire to dominate. And of course that's a purely, that could be the case, and I also think that it's even reasonable to posit that to some degree that it is the case. But to take that from a contributing factor and to make that the highest God, because that's essentially what the deconstructionists are doing, those are entirely different things. And you have to beware of people who take a single causal element and elevate it to the stature of single comprehensive cause. You know, it's more reasonable to assume that people are complex in their motivations, and that many different strands of biological and cultural motivation are in some sense primary, and that what happens is that they come together to weave a kind of tapestry, rather than to make the automatic assumption that you can reduce the entire set of human motivations to a single principle, like that of power. Now, you know, I would say Nietzsche is also responsible to some degree for the deconstructionist claim that it's power, because one of his most famous utterances was that the fundamental motivating force in life is the will to power. But he wasn't so much, because Nietzsche is a subtle thinker, he wasn't so much attempting to reduce human motivation to power. He was attempting to redefine what it was that we conceptualized as power. Whereas that isn't what the deconstructionists are doing at all, because fundamentally they're Marxists, and they believe that, you know, they've ensconced themselves within an economic viewpoint, where, within a philosophical viewpoint, where economics is paramount, and where all that matters is power construed as socioeconomic domination, fundamentally. You know, and that's, in turn, is embedded in a metaphysics that's even deeper, which is a metaphysics that presumes that people are fundamentally materialist. And all of those things are all of those things are highly questionable. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in the paragraph when Nietzsche talks about the motivations of, you might consider them, people who are working in the middle ranks of bureaucracies, whether they're scientific or otherwise. So they're, in some sense, acting as cogs in a particular machine, and so that's what he's describing here. He says, in the case of scholars, or in the case of really scientific men, there may really be such a thing as an impulse to knowledge, some kind of small independent clockwork which, when well wound up, works away industriously to that end, without the rest of the scholarly impulses taking any material part therein. The actual interests of the scholar, therefore, are generally in quite another direction. It is the family, or in money-making, or in politics. It is, in fact, almost indifferent at what point of research his little machine is placed, and whether the hopeful young worker becomes a good philologist, someone who studied the origin of words, a mushroom specialist, or a chemist. He's not characterized becoming this by this. He's not characterized by becoming this or that. Nietzsche's point there, fundamentally, is that even when you do analyze people in whom the will to knowledge might actually be operative, even though he wouldn't be willing to grant it the status of highest motivating power, that even in those people where that will to knowledge does exist, the probability that that is in turn subordinated to some other principle that's higher in the value hierarchy is very, very high. And it's hard to tell exactly what that additional principle might be, but he points out such things as, well, maybe they're primarily interested in serving the interests of their family, or they're primarily interested in making money, or maybe they're primarily interested in status, and maybe they're interested in status because it makes them more sexually attractive, and that sort of thing. So, but the question of what is it that's lurking in the background is always paramount. So, another detour in this particular paragraph. Whoever considers the fundamental impulses of man with a view to determining how far they may have here acted as inspiring genii or as demons will find that they have all practiced philosophy at one time or another, and that each of them would have been only too glad to look upon itself as the ultimate end of existence and the legitimate lord over all of the other impulses. That's another, like, Beyond Good and Evil, to think of it as a book is a really foolish framework, because this is what a book is when people think about a book. It's like a material entity. It's 8 inches high and 6 inches wide and 2 inches thick and weighs a pound, and it's made out of paper, and it's between two covers. And that's a materialist. That's the a priori sort of axiomatic view of a book. But Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil isn't a book at all. It's a series of bombs, and each sentence is a bomb, and each sentence blows things up that people don't even know exist. And so one of the things with this sentence, for example, here's how he's conceptualizing a human being. So the first thing he talks about is that there are fundamental impulses in human beings. Okay, so that begs the questions. Well, what do you mean by impulse? And what do you mean by fundamental? And both of those are extraordinarily complicated problems. So an impulse, you can think of an impulse as a drive. You could think about it as a biological instinct. You could think about it as an aim or a goal. You could think about it as an act of will. Like there's endless questions that hang off that question, but we could start with the idea that we perhaps can't define it, but we are willing to go with the proposition that people do have impulses. And I think maybe that's manifest to you most particularly when you're attempting to do something voluntarily, and something involuntarily interferes with that. So maybe you're sitting down to try to get some work done, and the work is not of any particular intrinsic interest, but you regard it as necessary, necessary element in some higher order scheme. And so you're attempting to organize yourself so you will in fact concentrate on that particular relatively mundane activity. But what you find when you sit down to actually engage in that is you can't do it. You have to go do the dishes, or you have to clean under the bed, or you have to have a sexual fantasy, or there's some other thing that you could do that's useful but that you wouldn't normally do that you'll go do instead, or that you fall asleep, or that you get hungry, or like there's an endless number of, let's call them impulses, that might arise to interfere with your conscious movement forward. Well, exactly what are those things? Well, Nietzsche certainly conceptualizes the human being as a place where those things live. And he does mean live too, because he wouldn't refer to them as demons or genies without introducing the metaphorical conception of something that lives. And so partly what Nietzsche reveals in those sentences is that he conceptualizes a human being as the dwelling place of spirits. And some of them are genii, let's say. That's the root word of genius. That's the terribly powerful thing that exists in the terribly small compartment, right, that you have to call forth. And some of them are demons. And demons are things that have their own autonomous will and that generally aren't aiming for the good. So those are all things Nietzsche just lays out as implicit parts of the sentence. So he activates all those ideas, whether you know it or not, in your mind to the degree that you process the sentence. And those things start to take on a life of their own, those ideas. And so then he adds another dimension of complexity to that by saying, well, you're full of demons and genies, and they're all doing their own thing, whatever that happens to be. But each of them, if left to their own devices, would attempt to remake the entire world in their form. And so I thought of this from a narrative point of view, or from a symbolic point of view. In old stories, in folk tales and fairy tales, you often have cyclops, or one-eyed giants. And there's a sexual connotation to that, which is apropos that the psychoanalysts would certainly point out. But the one-eye idea is that this thing is gigantic and wants one thing. And so that's another way that Nietzsche is conceptualizing the fundamental structure of the human psyche. It's a dwelling place full of one-eyed giants, and they're constantly, well, one way of looking at it is they're constantly at war. One of them wants to be the largest one-eyed giant and dominate everything else. And then one of the things that, so Nietzsche takes that argument further, and he says, not only is this always happening in human beings, but that if you look at philosophy, what it is it's a continual revelation of the attempt of some singular-minded psychic monster, psychological monster, to dominate the entire psychological structure, and therefore the entire cultural structure, and therefore the entire world. And then you can see in that the entire religious struggle of mankind to take this vast polytheistic vision of reality and to organize it into some sort of monotheistic and integrated structure, which you could also consider indistinguishable from the civilizing, the impulse that operates in human beings to become civilized. Because on the one hand, it might be a terrible thing that one-eyed monster emerges to attempt to dominate all the others. But then on the other hand, there's no difference between that and organizing something. Because to organize something is to bring it all into a hierarchical structure with some sort of singular value at the forefront. And then the question might be, well, what should that singular value be? And then Nietzsche that ties the whole argument back into the first sentences that he wrote at the beginning of the paragraph, which is, well, what is it that the philosopher is up to? What is the force that he's serving? What is the unifying impulse? That's another way of looking at it. If there's a unifying impulse, and he's not only fallen prey to some internal demon, if there's a unifying impulse to bring all of this together into some sort of functional structure, what exactly might that look like? For every impulse is imperious, and as such attempts to philosophize. That's sort of Nietzsche's idea of will to power in its nascent form. Like all of these unconscious entities that inhabit the human psyche are all alive, and they're trying to live, they're trying to climb up the dominance hierarchy and dominate, because of course that's partly what life does, because let's say from an evolutionary perspective, and this is probably more true for males because they're less effective in their attempts to replicate, the distinction between climbing up a dominance hierarchy, whatever that might happen to be, and success is, there may be no distinction at all. And then you might say, well, that just shows that there's nothing but will to power. But that still doesn't answer one of the most fundamental questions, is that power in relationship to what? Because that's the question. Okay, so you can shut that off if you would.